the go live button, so everything after this should be live.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Shundle, and I serve as co-chair of the Social Work Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being recorded remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Present.
Donna Honer-Queel. Sarah Behrens. Sarah?
Present. Can you hear me?
Now I can, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Mary Gill. Mike Gillette. Leanne, I'm sorry.
Mike did send me a message that said he might be a little bit later writing to the meeting.
Okay. Leanne Gingery. Angie Heller Workman.
Present.
Jane Holzrichter.
Present.
Catherine Reck.
Present.
Eric Schonecker.
Present.
Kristen Stice.
Present.
And Robin Unruh. I note the following BSRB staff members are also present: David Fye and Leslie Allen.
And also Sammy Barksdale is in attendance as well. She's here to receive information too if necessary.
She's here, excuse me, for
She-
what reason?
She's here if there's any additional information that she can provide as well.
Okay, thank you. Next, David Fry will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Cynthia. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns with the Kansas Open Meeting Act or COMA. Does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting to allow sufficient time for the committee to go through all items on the agenda. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. On March 21st, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who have requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, asbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. And agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call is active. We did go ahead and start that before the meeting began.
Thank you. The meeting's now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda. And David, would you be able to put that agenda up for us on the screen? Yeah. Okay. So first item on the agenda would be the agenda approval. Did everyone receive that in your email prior to the meeting? And had you had a chance to look at it? Yes. So I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
This is Jane Holzrichter. I'll make a motion to approve the agenda of December's.
Thank you, Jane. Any second?
And just for clarification, Jane, were you talking about approving the agenda for this meeting?
Oh. Sorry, I was thinking of minutes. I will approve the agenda for this meeting. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
And this is Angie Heller Workman. I'll second that.
Thank you. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes. Next, we do need to review and approve the minutes from our last meeting, which actually was on December 20th, since we rescheduled our meeting in February. So have you all had a chance to look at the minutes from our last meeting? And if so, is there a motion to approve them?
This is Sarah Behrens, and I'll motion to approve.
Thank you, Sarah. Do I have a second?
This is Eric. I'll second.
Thanks, Eric. All in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. Okay, let's move on to Executive Director's report. David?
Thank you, Cynthia. So I'll go ahead and provide a few updates on the agenda. I highlighted a couple of different items, but I'll touch on some BSRB operations as well. Last year, the federal government made some Spark funding available. This was related to the COVID-19 pandemic. There was some funding made available to state agencies to submit essentially grant requests for equipment modernization and technology modernization. So on behalf of the BSRB, I did go ahead and put a submission forward for two items. One was to purchase a camera for our boardroom to allow for better ability to do hybrid meetings, and then also to replace our existing projector from that meeting. We use that when we do hybrid meetings to show individuals who are attending remotely on the screen. And so having those two pieces of equipment, one new and the other one, it was very aged and needed to be replaced. And so those were both approved, and the BSRB received a little bit of funding to replace those two items, a little over $2,000. So I've been working with the governor's office and the different entities to make sure we're doing all of the federal reporting requirements. And so just happy to announce that it's going to save the agency a little bit of money, which is a good item because it makes us go a little bit longer before looking at revisiting any kind of fee increases or anything like that. So we hope to have that material. Those items actually are supposed to be delivered today. And individuals from OITS, the Office of Information Technology Services, they should be coming to help us out with those items later on this afternoon. So excited to share that with you. In terms of some other items, the social work multi-state compact, you received some information on that. It was being drafted last year, and we had representatives come to the advisory committee and kind of walk through some of those items in the compact. That language was not finalized at the start of the year, and so that group of drafters continued to meet, and in, I believe, late February, finalized the language on the compact. So that compact language has been posted, and as you recall, with multi-state compacts, you have uniform, essentially multi-state compact language that would have to be passed in the same version for different states. And so if they did pass that, then they could become part of the compact. And so it came along too far into the session for Kansas to be considering the compact this year. However, there are about 8 states that are discussing it. Now, I anticipate many of those states will probably carry it forward next year to continue having discussions on it. I just came back from the mid-year conference for the Association of Social Work Boards that met at the end of last week. Actually just got back into town yesterday afternoon. And they did talk a little bit about the compact, but some of the language in the final version is a little bit different than the version that you received information on before. So I do think it'd be helpful for representatives from the Council of State Governments to come back to the advisory committee and talk about some of the changes and some of the language, because it is a little bit confusing or a little bit difficult to really kind of work through on some of those items. So, but the language has been finalized, it is posted. So I recommend everybody going ahead and looking through that to see those uniform requirements that would have to be met for the states. And then also there are requirements in there for individuals within those states that would like to practice under the compact. So there's some distinctions in both ways. But that was something that was put out this year. I anticipate that it will be coming forward in Kansas by some group who would recommend that it be passed. And so I think it'd be helpful for us to have a further conversation on that, perhaps with Representative CHD, who can walk through some of those changes that were finalized. In terms of some legislative updates, so this year we talked a little bit back in December about items that the advisory committee would forward to the board, and then ultimately the board would put forward any kind of recommendations for changes to statutes, and those would need to go in front of the legislature in the form of a bill. Also, when we have each legislative session, the advisory committee, I'll go ahead and stop sharing the agenda for right now, but we can come back to it if we want to in the future. So when we have each legislative session, one of the items that happens is the legislature approves a budget for the BSRB. And usually they approve the current year's budget with any adjustments, and then they approve either 1 year into the future or sometimes 2 years into the future. As a fee-funded agency, we are called a biennial agency, and so frequently we have 2 budget years that are approved into the future, and then we can make adjustments as we go. But we do not receive any money from the state. We pay the state 10% of all revenue by statute. And then what the legislature does is they set an expenditure limitation by year. So even if we have money in the agency's fee fund, the legislature establishes how much we can spend on a year-to-year basis. And as a small agency, a lot of our expenditures are either on the cost of staff or the services that we contract with, for, let's say, legal services, or the agency that hosts our licensing database. And so as those prices change, we make revisions to the legislature as far as any other items as well. So this year, I'll talk about the budget first. So the budget for the BSRB was submitted, and that is approved separately by both the House and the Senate. And when it went before the Senate, there were no changes from what the governor had recommended for the agency's budget. When it went before the House, there was a proviso that was added in front of the House Higher Education Budget Committee, which was the group that considered the agency's budget. And that proviso that was added would basically limit the BSRB from requiring, as a condition of licensure, or as a requirement to renew a license. It would restrict the ability of the BSRB to require or have individuals demonstrate familiarity with any training, education, or instruction program that includes diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, critical race theory, or other related topics. Though it is noted that the language did not apply to equal opportunity or equal employment opportunity materials designed to inform individuals about the prohibition on discrimination based on a protected class status under the state or federal law. And I know that language is kind of confusing, but I wanted to read the exact language they put on and then kind of explain. So the BSRB currently requires continuing education in 2 areas. We require that you receive between 30 to 50 hours every 2-year license period for the different professions we regulate, and that's different by profession. But within that total number of hours, you have to have 3 hours of ethics. And then for the levels of licensure that diagnose and treat, we require 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment every 2-year period. The board, in its request for a bill before the legislature, made a recommended change to the statutes that there would be a decrease in the number of hours of diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours every 2-year license period. And then for all individuals with a permanent license under the BSRB to have a new 3-hour requirement of continuing education and cultural diversity training. And so this was not something that we're currently requiring. It was an item that the board put forward in the bill. But when the budget committee was reviewing the agency's budget, they asked me some questions about that bill introduction. And they decided, when reviewing and approving the agency's budget, they would add that language, which would essentially have the effect of, if that did pass in the bill, we would not be able to enforce the requirement of making sure individuals had 3 hours of continuing education and cultural diversity. Provisos are not common, but they do happen from time to time. And so that was put on by the House Higher Education Budget Committee. When the budget advanced to the House Appropriations Committee, The House Appropriations Committee discussed that, whether it should stay on the budget or whether it should be removed. Ultimately, they voted that it should stay on the agency's budget and it advanced forward. And like I mentioned, the House and the Senate approved different versions of the agency's budget. When the House Appropriations Committee and Senate Ways and Means Committee each passed their own budget on their chamber's floor, they went together to resolve items of difference. And this language for the BSRB was an item of difference. They made rounds back and forth on all of those items of difference. And ultimately, the consensus appropriations bill, which was passed by the legislature, included that proviso language, which would restrict the agency from requiring essentially the continuing education in those topics that were listed. Now, when the appropriations bill went to the governor does have the ability to make line item vetoes. And so just a few days ago, the governor was reviewing the appropriations bill and made about nine line item vetoes. And one of those items was to strike the language, which would have prohibited us from being able to require that type of continuing education. So that has been vetoed by the governor out of the appropriations bill. Just to let you know about the legislative session, the legislature has phases of each session. And there's a phase where everyone tries to pass a bill in their own chamber's floor, and they have to get it across by a certain deadline for most committees. And then after that, they try to pass bills that started in the other chamber. And then they leave for about 2 weeks and they come back for a little wrap-up session, which is generally called omnibus. And omnibus for some of the members of the legislature started today. The House and the Senate finance committees or the appropriations committees, they come back for about 2 days and have an omnibus memo that's put together by the Legislative Research Department, where it lists out all the items that are still pending consideration by the legislature. And then the full legislature comes back on Wednesday and they can work any bills further. And so it is possible when the legislature comes back, they can consider any vetoes or any other additional legislation. And so I just wanted to let you know where we stand at the moment. Where we stand at the moment was that the proviso language was passed by the legislature. It was vetoed by the governor. And now we're waiting to see what the final action will be concerning legislative overview of the governor's veto. Before I go on to any other topics, I just kind of wanted to pause and see if you have any questions about that item.
David, this is Jane. Do you know what the thought process was for vetoing that?
I did. So in the summary of the appropriations bill, when the governor signs it, she does usually include a letter that explains what she is line item vetoing and then the reasons for that. I did read that section of the appropriations bill, but I don't recall the exact language she used in terms of why she chose to veto that section. I can let you know that the section that included that proviso was separate from the main expenditure limitation for the agency. So she was able to veto that section without impacting our ability to spend money for future years. So we're not in danger of not being able to fund operations. But she did include something there, and I think there may have been some articles about some of her vetoes as well. So I don't know if they included language about that in the articles, but if you want, I can go ahead and try to provide the bill number for the appropriations bill so you can take a look at that. Or actually, I can send you a copy of that after the meeting too, so you can take a look at that language.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no other questions right now about the proviso, I'll just talk a little bit about the BSRB bill, and then we can kind of bring everything together. So last year and over the last few years, there's been a number of legislative committees that have dealt with mental health topics, and individuals have looked for ways in which we can help address certain issues and certain problems. And one of the items that has probably received the most conversation is how to address workforce type issues. And so the board last year and you as an advisory committee worked very hard and considering different options that would be helpful, looking at reviewing the statutes for the agency, looking at reviewing the regulations for the agency. And there were some items that were put forward as recommendations to the board. And ultimately the board considered those items and any other items too, and made final recommendations for a bill. And recommendations for that bill were introduced in front of the legislature, I went to the House Health and Human Services Committee, as well as the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee, and introduced identical versions of bills, which encompassed all of the board's recommendations for changes. The bill itself was about 65 pages. And part of the reason it was that long is because when you regulate 7 different professions, sometimes there are similar statutes, but there's a different one for every profession. So you're going to see the same changes repeatedly, but there were about 10 to 15 significant changes, and then there was some legislative cleanup. In the final version of the bill, which for the House was House Bill 2340, the items that were included in the bill included some items such as changes to the reciprocity requirements. For most of the professions right now, there's a general statute that would indicate that if you could either come from a jurisdiction with substantially equivalent licensure requirements, or you would have to work in that jurisdiction for 48 of the past 54 months. Each of the advisory committees was asked to weigh in on that, and then the board made a general consensus recommendation for to have uniform changes on that item. The uniform change the board recommended was to decrease the amount of time from 48 months down to 12 months. And I think part of the reason for that is a bill passed a couple years ago for reciprocity for military members, military spouses, but it also included individuals that reside in Kansas and those that intend to reside in Kansas. And there was some confusion about who all qualified under that bill. But dropping the time frame down from 48 months to 12 months makes a more consistent reciprocity time frame for some of those individuals who apply for reciprocity. Additionally, we had good conversations about how to address workforce in terms of those individuals that are currently licensed. One thing that we have seen is when we look at licensure, we see that we are licensing more individuals than we are experiencing growth. And that is partially true by individuals who are allowing their licenses to expire. And some of those individuals are reaching retirement age, but other individuals are stepping away either because they have a health issue or someone close to them has a health issue, or they're seeking to start a family, or they have burnout, or for a number of different reasons. But some items come up unexpectedly. And so one item the board included in that language was a process by which if individuals have an extreme situation and they weren't able to finish their continuing education hours, they had a process where they could request an extension. They would need to show that there was an extenuating circumstance that was extreme that led to them not being able to finish those hours in time. And then if their submission was approved, they could be approved for up to 3 more months to finish those hours. And the benefit of this is that they would be able to get approval and they could renew their license, but know that they had additional time to finish those remaining hours from the past licensure period. And this was done in an effort to make sure that people who were on the borderline about should I let my license expire or not, if we could help those individuals stay licensed by providing some flexibility. And so that was one of the items that was included. Additionally, I mentioned individuals have let their licenses expire, but we know those individuals in a lot of cases are still out there and may want to come back if we can assist them in making that process a little easier. So right now, if you want to have your license reinstated after it expired, you have to pay essentially double the license fee, and then you would need to have all the continuing education hours from the past license period. Well, for individuals who have had their license expired for over a year, to help them in the process of coming back, the language in the bill would decrease that cost by half. And so it would be half the current cost to reactivate your license and reinstate your license. And then also, if you don't have enough of the continuing education hours from the past license period, we introduced a new temporary reinstatement license that would only last for 6 months, but it would be a way for people who were previously licensed to come back and start working under that short-term temporary license while finishing up those hours. And then once they finish the hours, they could have their full permanent license reinstated. And so be a way to get people back into the workforce more quickly when they're trying to re-enter these professions. Additionally, we had heard that some individuals were struggling to pass their licensure examinations. And when we looked at the temporary licenses we have right now, where individuals can work for a year while trying to take the test and pass the test, we found that some of the other temporary licenses lasted 2 years. And one way the board thought they could be helpful in this area was to extend the time frame for the temporary licenses from 1 year to 2 years. And so if individuals are working under a temporary license, they're struggling to pass the licensure examination, or something comes up unexpectedly, That would prevent them from taking the licensure examination. This would allow them more time to take the test. And if they didn't pass on the first attempt, they would have some flexibility to be able to keep working while taking that test. So that was one way the board was trying to help address that issue. And it provides more security for employers too, who are providing some employment to those individuals with temporary licenses. Additionally, you had heard the conversation about individuals who apply for licensure from programs that are in the process of becoming accredited through CSWE, the Council of Social Work Education. And that process can take about 3 to 3.5 years. So for new programs that are starting up, you're going to have individuals come from those programs that the programs have not become accredited yet. And they are in a process called candidacy, where they're meeting thresholds to show they are working their way towards accreditation. But right now, we don't have any clear language on how to help those people become permanently licensed unless they meet the alternative pathways to licensure and regulations based on substantial equivalence. But for some of these new programs, they're online only programs. And so some of the requirements are difficult for some of those new programs to meet. And so this new language in the bill would create new types of temporary licenses for individuals who come from a program for bachelor's or master's social work, from programs that are in accreditation or they're in candidacy for accreditation. And these licenses that would be temporary would last for 2 years, but these specific ones for the candidacy students or those that graduate from the programs, they could renew this license once. And so when the programs become fully accredited, then those individuals who hold these special licenses would be able to get full permanent licenses under the board. So it's a way for us to help those individuals from the programs and make sure they're not hurt too much by going to these programs that are seeking accreditation. So that temporary language for the licenses was modeled after what we had seen in Minnesota. They have something that's specifically designed like this. So we borrowed from them to use a process working in another state. Additionally, in another of the professions, there was language to create student temporary licenses for addiction counselors. These would be for individuals that are pursuing a bachelor's level addiction counseling license, but they have not attained the necessary coursework. They need to have about 60 hours, but they still have some ways to go. And this would be something that would provide a structured framework where there'd be an agreement between the school and employer. They would have to have supervision, and then working under this student temporary license would allow them to start working while finishing up the degree to get their permanent license. And so that was well received by the legislature as well. And then also I mentioned there were some cleanup items for the psychology profession. One of their license standards is a little bit different than some of the other professions. Most of the professions require someone to merit the public trust. For licensed psychology, it includes language about having good moral character. That good moral character language has mostly been phased out in other jurisdictions in favor of the meriting the public trust. And so that was a recommendation by the advisory committee and also recommended by the board to make their requirements for licensure a little more consistent with other professions and for other licensing bodies in other states. And then there was some language for the behavior analyst profession. When that profession was created in statute, the statutes were different than the other professions. And some of that language for disciplinary remedies was a bit lacking. For example, the language for the behavior analyst statute says that if someone commits a violation of unprofessional conduct, our hands are limited to being able to suspend a license or revoke the license. But if it's a minor violation, some of the other professions allow us to do things like issue a small fine or do a public censure. And so that language does not exist for the behavior analyst. So some of the language in the bill would make the disciplinary remedies more consistent with the other professions. And there was also some statutory cleanup, trying to condense some of the statutes so that there weren't as many that you would need to follow. Also modifying the language so some of those processes are easier to understand for individuals who are reading those and trying to understand the process. There was some reorganization in a way that would make things cleaner. And so those were the items that were put into the bill by the board that are still in the existing contents of the bill before the legislature. There were 3 other items that the board had recommended that have been removed when the bill was heard in the House committee. Those 3 items were that the board had recommended a recommendation from the Social Work Advisory Committee about adding a requirement for board approved supervisors for the social work profession. That item was removed by the House Health and Human Services Committee when that committee worked the bill. Additionally, There was a recommendation in the bill to add another board member, and that was for behavior analysis. Currently, there's 12 board members, 8 professional, 4 public, and there's not a member of the board for the behavior analyst profession. And so there's not someone to speak at board meetings concerning the intricacies as it relates to the public health or public protection mission of the board. And so the board recommended creating a new 13th board member and putting in statute that the governor would appoint a member of the behavior analysis profession. But that was removed by the committee when it was worked by the House Health and Human Services Committee. And so when that committee worked the bill, they not only removed items, they also added some new items to the bill. One of the items that they added dealt with the social work profession. The profession, one of the items that they put on as an amendment would go specifically towards the requirements for clinical licensure for social workers. Right now in the statute, there is a requirement of about 15 hours of coursework related to topics involved with diagnosing and treating. And what the legislature did was decrease that down from 15 hours down to 3. And it struck the titles of a lot of those specific courses that would have to be completed now to attain clinical licensure as a clinical social worker. Additionally, there is language in the statutes about us having a postgraduate practicum and also completing the 300 hours of postgraduate supervised experience. The current language requires that within that 3,000 hours, 1,500 hours must be in diagnosing and treating individuals. The language that the legislature added was that the 1,500 hours would have to include, but be not limited to, diagnosing and treating, which from a licensing perspective, when we're looking at enforcing standards based on the reading of the language, what that said to us was that right now we need to look to see if someone had 1,500 hours diagnosing and treating individuals. If you change that language that the 1,500 hours must include but be not limited to diagnosing and treating, as long as there was some hour included in that group of hours diagnosing and treating, that seems to meet that requirement. So it seems to drop it from a standard of 1,500 hours down to a standard of 1 hour, which would make it significantly different than the standards that currently exist. Also significantly different from the requirements for the other professions that license clinical professionals. Another item that the House Health and Human Services Committee added was the creation of something called a community-based license. And based on the description of that license, it appears that it would function like a temporary license. It would last no longer than 2 years, which is what the new standard would be under the bill for general temporary licenses. But it would be called a temporary license, and it would be for the professions of licensed psychology, social work, the bachelor's and master's level, marriage and family therapy at the regular marriage and family therapy license, and then also for professional counselors at that LPC level. And essentially, the main item under this would be that these would, the way it was initially written, was that these would have to be individuals who were employed within the scope of a community mental health center and under the supervision of someone's clinical license. And if they met those qualifications, and these would be for people who have not passed the licensing examination for a permanent license, but they have shown the other educational qualifications. So they would meet the same standard that we currently have for a temporary license. But if they met those standards and they worked for a CMHC and they were under clinical supervision, then according to the language that was in the bill, they would be able to use the initials. In the case of, let's say the LPs, they'd be able to just put LP after their name, or use the title of licensed psychologist without any kind of qualifier that their license was a temporary license. And that was specifically included in the statute. And I had heard behind the scenes that one of the reasons that they wanted this distinction, the ability to use those initials and those titles without a temporary qualifier, was because they had experienced some difficulty with some reimbursements. And so I understand where they were coming from. I think, when I informed the board about this, there was a lot of concern because it could mislead the public into thinking those individuals with temporary licenses were just the same as the individuals who hold permanent licenses. And it could lead them to believe that they had met all the requirements, including passing the examination. And it could also call into question, individuals who do meet those qualifications permanently. And if individuals from the public know that this new group of individuals with a temporary license are able to use those titles, it could make individuals from the public question whether anyone holding those existing titles really has a permanent license or something else. And so it could create quite a bit of confusion. And so that was the second item. The third item was something that was added in the bill that would create new timelines for the BSRB operational processes. And one of the items was that within 15 days of us receiving an application, we would have to provide a response back to the person who applied to let them know that we received their materials and whether or not their materials were complete or incomplete. We'd have to do a review and assessment within those first 15 days for anybody who applied for licensure or a permanent license or an assessment. And then we'd have to let them know if it was incomplete, what is still remaining. And then we would be required within the first 30 days of a complete application to make a decision on licensure. Additionally, it would require us to develop an expedited license process, whereas someone could pay an extra fee. And then when they submit their materials, we would need to make a decision within 15 days. Now, the language in the bill does not say we need to have a complete application. And that was the major concern that we had from licensing body's perspective, because we frequently don't receive all the information together. We frequently receive the application, initial paperwork by itself, perhaps the fee later on. We received materials from the schools in terms of educational content at separate times and at separate, different times. And so some of those operational changes were going to present some real difficulty for the agency. Right now, we ask people to allow for 30 to 45 days when we have a complete application, but this would require some new standards and law that would create some real challenges for us based on our current staffing levels. And if you have been to the BSRB office, you may have seen we don't have a lot of space to expand. In fact, we don't have any space right now to expand. And we have asked about other storage areas in the building so we can move things and get creative with that. They told us they could find some storage about a mile away from the agency, but that wouldn't allow us to be able to access our records. And so, we are trying to reevaluate things and figure out how to make that work. I mentioned earlier today, the legislature is considering items for omnibus. I did let them know that if those items concerning operations stay in the bill, we would need at least approval to have 2 more licensing staff members to try to meet those expectations. But I have severe concerns that these new performance measures, I think that'd be really challenging for us to do. And I think we would try to, we would want to be in compliance with law if this item is passed, but it would be very difficult for us to do this. And I think there would be some big bumps along the way. And so right now we don't have the staffing for that. We don't have the expenditure authority to try to make those things work. So I mentioned those items were added by the legislature. There was not an opportunity to provide comments in front of the House committee when those items were added, because the way they do it is they have a hearing on the initial bill, and then they come back as a committee and work things, and they put on amendments real quickly, and then they're done. And then it moves forward. And so after those items were added, I spoke to the members of the House committee in terms of those, the chair and the vice chair and the ranking minority member, and expressed the real serious concerns by the agency on those issues, and requested changes on the House floor, and they did not make amendments to that. When it went over to the Senate, we did have an opportunity to talk to the board in between that and relayed all the information. The board had severe concerns, and they asked me to make those known that would work in the Senate committee. So the bill did have a hearing in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. And in preparation for that, I went ahead and scheduled meetings. And in terms of before the hearing and right after the hearing, I met with every single member of the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee, scheduled meetings with each individual member one-to-one in their office, because I realized the issues were complex, and I wanted to make it clear what the position of the board was on these items, and also some of our some of these things are just difficult to really make sure to understand why they're problematic. And so I talked to every single member. Some of them I actually talked with before the hearing and after the hearing. And I provided some amendments in my testimony. They could introduce. I requested members make those amendments. But when they worked with the bill in the committee, they did not make those amendments to remove those items or to adjust them. And so those did stay on when it was worked by the Senate. They added one amendment, which basically would say if you had a student temporary license as an addiction counselor, you could not later have a community-based license, which was not something that we had requested. It did not address the concerns about the board or the agency, but it was the only amendment they added. And so it was eligible to work on the Senate floor, but the Senate did not work it on the floor. So for all intents and purposes, that House Bill 2340, that was the agency's bill, is more or less dead for this session, except when you have bills that pass one chamber, there is a process called conference committee that I mentioned earlier, where the House and the Senate come together to deal with items of difference. And when they do that, you can combine certain bills together when they go to conference committee. So even though our bill did not pass the Senate floor, I did find out that when they met right before they adjourned for their 2-week break, they had a number of meetings, some of those as late in the day as 4 a.m. or 4:30 in the morning. And one of those late night conference committees did focus on health bills, and the BSRB bill was combined into the conference committee report or substitute for Senate Bill 131. And when they did that, the modifications they changed. One of the items was they said that the community-based licenses, you could not have a community-based license and then later a temporary license. So that was a choice. You had to do one or the other. And then they also expanded those community-based licenses. So they would no longer be for just the CMHCs, but it would also include individuals under the scope of employment of a federally qualified health center, the FQHCs, psychiatric residential treatment facilities or PRTFs, and also private facilities as they're defined in KSA 59-29B46. And I believe those are some of the drug and alcohol abuse facilities. And so it's difficult to see if any other changes were made when they put it into conference, because it's not in the same format as you would normally see a bill. Those conference committee reports are not the easiest to read or find the items of difference, but as best as I can determine, those are the things that were modified. So I mentioned those were put into the conference committee report. It was forwarded to the legislature. It was available to be worked by both the House and the Senate before they broke, but they did not work it on the chamber's floors. So when they come back on Wednesday, it could be one of the last bills they pass this session, or it could carry over and be available for them to consider next year. But there's a number of items that are problematic in the bill. You know, I've done all that I could think of in terms of talking with individuals. When the House made those changes, I had conversations with the chair and the vice chair of the board, talked to the full board at the board meeting. I even set up meetings with the individuals from the different associations that I believe were advocating for some of those changes to see if perhaps we could have more conversation, to see if we could find some compromise language to really, get at the issues of concern that I think they were concerned with, to see if there was a way that we could really work through these things and come to a way that would not create so many problems. And I thought based on those conversations that there was some good positive reception to that. And then I thought when talking with the Senate committee members that they understood the issues, but then those amendments were not adopted. And the only amendment I think on our behalf that the Senate committee made, there was a member of the Senate committee who voted to table the bill for this session because he understood that there were issues and problems, and he wanted to allow more time for us to work with different groups to really work on some consensus language, but the committee was not in favor of tabling the bill. So, so we are waiting to see what the final outcome of the bill will be. On behalf of the agency, I've done everything I think that I could think of to make sure that people were informed and make sure that the board's concerns were addressed. But right now we're kind of waiting to see if the bill passes. We will do everything we can to be compliant with the law. But right now we're just kind of waiting to see how things will shake out in the last probably week and a half of the legislative session. So I realize that is a lot, and being so deep into the weeds over at the Capitol, I spent a fair amount of time over at the Capitol building, meeting with people, trying to resolve these issues. So I realize I've had a very in the weeds look at it, but if you have any questions about any of those items, I wanted to give some time today so that you could ask any questions about those items.
David, I have a question. So as you talked about some of the concerns, and I'm not going to list them because there were multiple, but that went ahead and went through legislative Senate and House, and didn't necessarily take advice from the executive director of BSRB. Is there an opportunity at all before a governor decides to sign or veto that you, as a representative for BSRB, can have a conversation, or is that not allowed?
Yeah, I think if the legislature does pass the bill, I will definitely reach out to the governor's office and make sure that there's communication from our agency, so that she will understand the concerns of the board. And I do want to make sure that everybody knows, I spent time at the beginning of this report talking about all the different items the board wanted to put in. So the board was not against change. We had a lot of good items, really positive items that had been worked through. But I do think some of those later amendments are really problematic. But yeah, if the bill does pass, I'll reach out to the governor's office and try to set up a meeting with the governor herself or a member of her staff and just kind of walk through, and so then make sure the governor knows about these concerns.
Thank you.
I'd like to just add a bit to the piece about testifying. I did go and testify at the Senate hearing, and it was a 1-hour hearing in which they were considering 4 different bills, and there were 16 people who wanted to testify. So we each got 2 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. I tried to reach out to my own senator who was on that committee afterwards and didn't receive a response. I'll be following up with her. But the issue that I was most concerned about was the complete change in the definition of clinical social work from what it has been for the last 20 years to including but not limited to training in diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders, which is the definition of clinical social work. And so that would dramatically change the qualification of clinical social workers and make us inferior to all the other licensed mental health professions. We would not be able to say that clinical social workers were equal in terms of their training and competency if they only have to have 1 or 2 hours of actual training in diagnosis and treatment, and the rest of their 1,500 hours could be in any other type of social work. It doesn't even say social work, but it says including but not limited to. So I will definitely be talking about ways to mitigate that if it gets passed. And I don't know what the options are. It's such a vague designation. It's going to be a nightmare for the board to regulate, because how do we define including but not limited to? So I personally hope it does not pass, so we have a chance to present a modified bill next year. Although, would this stay alive, David?
Yes.
If it doesn't, it would stay alive another year in its bundled form or as a separate bill?
So it would stay alive in its bundled form. Once the conference committee reports are put together, the legislature is not able to amend those on the floor. So if they vote on a conference committee report, they have to just say yes or no. So it would stay alive if they don't work with this year, and would be available potentially to be worked next year.
Well, it's bundled with 2 other bills that are health and welfare related, and that are not nearly as complex as our bill. But my fear is that in their desire to get something done, they will, and to not get down in the weeds and really, learn about what these provisions would actually mean to consumers in Kansas. Consumers of mental health services will not be as safe with those changed provisions for clinical social work. But my fear is that they will go ahead and pass that bundle just to be able to have gotten something done. So we'll see what happens with that.
I equate it almost like a general doctor doing surgery on any orthopedic or any other part of the body.
Right.
We have due diligence to make, good informed decisions for our clients.
Right. it's like a podiatrist doing heart surgery. Yeah,
Right.
that's
Right.
not who I would want cutting on my heart.
Yeah.
So,
That would be my 2-minute comment.
yeah, exactly. Well, we'll definitely keep the advisory committee informed if there is any opportunity for comment or, sending any messages to your legislators, et cetera. David, will you know when that bill is going to be considered on the floor, the bundled bill?
So now that it's a conference committee report, it can just be called, from my understanding. So we may not have a lot of notice on the specific day if it's worked. I may get a notification that now they're working it, or they just worked it. And so at this point, there's just not a lot of notice. Things happen very quickly as they get towards the end.
This is
So
Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
I wondered if we retain the sense of working within our competency level in the law. And so then we're able, as the board or as the BSRB, would be able to hold people to a standard of, so like the illustration of the doctor doing orthopedic surgery or whatever. Anyway, working within your level of competency as a kind of a catchphrase to help us. It just causes a lot more work on the regulatory board. But anyway.
Well, if there was a complaint against someone who was licensed under this new provision and didn't have, very much actual clinical training, we could probably, that unprofessional conduct guideline that or requirement that you only practice within your areas of competency could probably be used, but we can't use it preemptively, I don't think. So we would have to license people that we don't really consider qualified as clinicians. And, one of the arguments that was made by those who were putting forth this bill, who unfortunately were 2 social workers, was that, well, there's lots of LSCSWs that do not do clinical work. And my point was, well, that doesn't matter. They are authorized to do so. And so they should be competent to do so, even if they're not in a position where they have to use their clinical skills. There could be, David and I talked about this earlier, that there could be other specialist licenses. The statute allows for that, and that might be something worth proposing. There could be a specialist administrative social worker, a specialist medical social worker. When I was a school social worker, I had to have a separate, it wasn't through the BSRB, but it was an educational, license that I had. They've done away with that now. But at that time, there was a separate kind of specialist category for school social workers. So there could be other clinical or other specialist licenses that would enable people who wanted to have that highest level of licensure in their field of practice to have that. But people who are not clinicians should not be authorized to diagnose and treat mental disorders, in my opinion. So that's where that is.
Well, one thing I wanted to take away from this experience, because this is definitely a new experience for me, is that I think, if the board offers bills in the future, I will make a better effort on my part to make sure that, and Cynthia, I thought you attending that meeting and providing testimony was fantastic. I think sometimes when the members of the legislative committees hear from certain individuals, they can get an idea, or they might think, oh, well, this represents all of the people in this profession and all the people in this industry. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. In a lot of cases, someone really wants to make a change, and then they get a few people to come and speak on that issue, and then that's the only voice that's really heard. So when you were right, when we got 2 minutes apiece, talking about a 65-page bill, spending a minute talking about all the positive things, and then spending a minute trying to explain complicated things as far as potential issues, that's really tricky. And then trying to make sure that we have good information out there too, is really something I'm going to try to make sure that we have individuals bring forward. I know that there are people who want to be helpful on these things, and I know there's been a lot of conversation about workforce, but I think some of the information that's put out there is misleading, and sometimes it's incorrect. I just want to share something with you all. This is a document that I share with the board members every full board meeting, but this is a history of permanent licenses under the BSRB. And I heard people in committee talk about, well, we're not, we are losing people and they're leaving to go to other states, which on a person by person basis, people do leave to go to other states. But I just want to show you what's happened over this time period for BSRB licensees. This is a history going back to July 2015, but I could go back even further. But since that time, just in the last 7-8 years, permanent licenses about 7 or 8 years ago totaled 12,152. Now they are almost at 15,000. And so we've had thousands of new licenses that have been issued over this time period, not just replacing individuals that have retired, but growth. We've seen tremendous growth over the past few years. When you look at the clinical level of social workers, back in July of 2015, there was 1,966. Now there's 2,804. So we've had about a 50% increase in the number of clinical social workers just in the last 7-8 years. When you look at social work as a profession, on the second page, it has risen from 7,263 to about 8,104. So we have almost 1,000 more social workers in the time period of 7 years. So I think it's important to get this information out there because there are people who will say, oh, there's just nobody here in Kansas. We don't have any licensees. And it's like, well, I think one of the issues is yes, we need more. And part of that is because we have a growing need for practitioners. And I think that's why the board is having these conversations, looking at creative methods to have pipelines of, student licenses, or how can we, look at things, but to do it in a real good way. But I want to show you these numbers because I believe the things the board has been working on and has considered, they are working. But I think if individuals get the message that, we're not licensing anyone, or that the professions are shrinking or not growing, then I think we need to come back with the truth and kind of show them that, overall, we have a lot more people licensed than we used to have just a few years ago. And the board is really interested in making sure that we continue to modernize and look at other types of licensure. So I think I'll have more information like this, but I want to make sure that you were all aware of these numbers too. So I also, I heard some people talk about our number of licensees compared to other states. And I think one thing that's always a little bit deceptive in that conversation is the population of Kansas compared to other states. For example, Kansas versus Missouri. Missouri has over twice the population of Kansas. And so, of course, Missouri is going to have more social workers. But what I did is I looked at some of those licensed numbers, and I found that actually Missouri in total social work licenses has just a little bit more than Kansas. And so when you look at it on a proportion level, I looked at the ranking of Kansas out of the 50 states. And when you look at social workers compared to the population, I believe Kansas comes in right around somewhere between 12 or 13 out of all the states in the United States. And Missouri has a far lower ratio in terms of social workers per population. But when people hear, oh, well, they have more social workers than us, and you never know how important those things are towards someone's final vote. But I do feel like this has been eye-opening for me to try to make sure that if we do have items come forward in the bill in the future, I will probably come to you as an advisory committee and encourage you to maybe come to those committees remotely or in person and just kind of just share your thoughts and share your experience. Because I do think these conversations that you're having in the advisory committee, I think these are helpful. And I think your voices will be helpful in this conversation too. So if we do go forward on things in the future, I'll do a better job communicating things to you to give you some opportunities to perhaps testify at certain hearings.
And I would just like to add to that workforce issues are definitely a concern, and really that whole bill that the BSRB put forth was primarily addressing those kinds of tweaks that would improve workforce accessibility. But the way to increase workforce is not to lower the standards to a level that puts unqualified people out there with licensure, practicing without the necessary skill set. So, and I do think that at the minimum, we could all just communicate with our senators, state senators, and name this bundled bill. It's CCR. What's the number, David?
It's 131. Conference committee report. I think it's Senate
See-
substitute for Senate Bill 131.
But it's going to be, it'll be heard on the Senate floor with the whole Senate, right?
Right, at this point, those conference committee reports are heard on the floor for the House or the Senate, because both chambers would need to work them on the floor. They wouldn't be able to modify them any further. It's just a yes vote or a no vote. But if it does come before, then all the members of the House or Senate would have the opportunity to vote.
So David, you cut out. I couldn't hear what you said the number was.
Oh,
CRC?
It's a conference committee report for Senate Bill 131.
Is
So
there
yeah,
a place where people can get a copy of that to read it, or where would we find that?
So if you go to the legislative website, you can pull it down directly from that website. For you as advisory committee members, I'd be happy to send you a copy of that as well. So I could
Okay.
send you a copy of the appropriations report or the appropriations bill with the governor's message on the veto. That also can be found on the legislative website, but I can send you a copy of that and also a copy of the CCR Congress Committee report. Like I said, it's a little difficult to read, so I'll probably send you something that's CCRB, which is the Conference Committee Report 3. And it's a description of the different items that are in that report. And they kind of show a little bit of the history on it.
Great. Thank you.
although that summary does not include the provision for changing the definition of clinical social work. Somehow they got most everything else in there, but that provision was not included in the summary. So the senators reading that summary will have no idea about that. And that's what we can do in writing to our senators, is to make sure they're aware that that poison pill is in there and ask them to vote against it.
Yeah, and the individuals who write those summaries are the legislative research departments, and I do feel like they're a nonpartisan office. It's where I used to work, and so I do think they do a good job summarizing those items. But I think as complex as these issues are, I think unless you really have the expertise or really in there for every step, it's really hard to kind of understand that, oh, this line here, because you can't include everything in a summary. But I think they usually do a pretty good job, but there were a few items that are missing from those conference committee report briefs that are really at the heart of the issue. And one of those is concerning the community-based licenses, using the title and the initials. And then, as you mentioned, Cynthia, there's other items too that it would be helpful to have those highlighted so people would know the exact licenses.
Okay, and yet
I know that so many things I could update you on, but I know we won't have a lot of time for the other items on the agenda. I do just want to say I got back from the mid-year meeting from ASWB yesterday. I just got back into town late yesterday afternoon, so I haven't had a good opportunity to really summarize all that and put it together. So I'll probably talk about that more at our next advisory committee meeting. But it was a productive meeting. There was a good amount of conversation on the social work examination. I got a chance to talk to conversations that are happening in other states. I will say I thought there was some really productive sessions. There were representatives, of course, from ASWB because they were the ones hosting the conference, but there were also individuals there from the national chapter of NASW too. And so there was good conversation back and forth, and there was also communication about wanting to talk to the representatives from universities, the individuals who are doing the education in terms of helping students become qualified to become social workers, and how the test is formulated and the questions that are actually put on the test. So I want you to know that those conversations did happen at that conference, and I thought they were really positive, and it was helpful for me to hear from more individuals, in a larger circle as well. Because I do think one of the things, I believe there are different perspectives to have on this topic. But when people can all come to the table and ask questions, and you can kind of understand different perspectives, I think it was really helpful to hear from the people.
So I know NASW has come out with a strong statement recommending that the test be suspended, which I know some states have done, and we don't have the authority to do. because it's in statute. Was that discussed at the ASWB meeting? Did they talk about that? You say there was NASW reps there.
They did talk about that a little bit. We did talk about some of the conversations that have gone on in different states concerning the examination. Utah recently removed the requirements for the bachelor's level and master's level exams. It's a little bit different because I think up until just a few years ago, Utah did not require passage of those tests for those two levels. But definitely a lot of things I can share about the conversations I heard from individuals from those states, and I've started just kind of the research articles too to get some outside perspective. You want to get a full picture. There's also some conversations about Maryland. They had at least legislation that could have potentially removed the requirement for a bill, but they had a number of individuals come forward, and I think there were 3 individuals that are specifically exam test question writers that are from Maryland who provided some testimony in committee and spoke with some of the issues. And so, so in terms of removal of the exam, we're just kind of scratching the surface in terms of what states have taken action to do that. Some of that kind of ties into part of the conversation about what's required under the new multi-state compact draft language. So I think we want to make sure we have a good understanding of that as we look at, they seem to be kind of a connected topic because, someone's ability to practice under the compact would probably be affected by whether they pass the national examination. And like I said, that compact language is kind of difficult to understand. I think we could get some more clarifications on that from CSG. But I do think that those topics are kind of interrelated in certain ways concerning whether an exam should be required.
When one thought that we had talked about as well was that if the exam is suspended in whatever state, and again, it can't be in Kansas unless we change the statute. Would someone who was licensed in a state that didn't require the exam and wanted to get on the interstate compact, would they be able to take the exam on their own, even though it wasn't required in their state, and then qualify for the interstate compact? So that's a question we need to clarify with Council of State Governments that has put that together.
Well, and David, I wanted to ask, I thought we had this a little further down, but since you've talked about it, and I went back and reviewed the October 2022 recording. Did you hear any conversation at the national conference that you attended about whether there had been one question removed to make it 3? Because they said to us that that's what was happening come January 1. And I have multiple people telling me that is not the case that's taken the test.
Yeah, and I think there's probably been a little confusion about that item because I did ask ASWB about it specifically. It sounds like they have started to include some questions that had a 3 multiple choice, but they haven't replaced all of the 4 multiple choice. So I think what they're doing is a phase-in approach where they're replacing some of the 4 choice with 3 choice. And I asked them if they had a timeline of when they, if they're still planning to go to exclusively a 3. And they did say that the timeline, they do intend to go to a 3 option test, but they couldn't tell me exactly when they're going to move to exclusively doing that. It sounded like part of the reason they're doing a phase-in is, and this is a little bit higher level than me in terms of grading examinations, but it sounds like on some of those examinations, they include more questions than are actually factored into the score because they want to include questions that would be suitable for future tests. And so they put questions on there to see if there's any kind of, if a number of people miss a certain question or if there's language issues concerning what the question is actually asking towards. And so I think they're allowing some time to, phase in some of these 3 option questions, but it sounds like the ultimate end goal is to move to that to make sure that the test isn't a speed reading test or a reading comprehension test.
Okay. So my concern is when you come to something like the advisory board representing a state and you're trying to convince people to stay with your test, you don't say January 1, this is going to happen. You know, when you're representing like the ASWB, you say that we're still work in progress or phase in, but they gave a definite to us trying to help us to stay with their testing. And that's my concern. You know, were they prepared to come to us? I don't know. But you sure don't say come January 1, this is going to be basically enacted. And I'm using my word, not their word. But I did go back and listen. So I have concerns with, you know, even that alone. You know, let alone wanting to drop the clinical testing, because I don't think that's behooving us in our state. I think we have better ways to be able to look at competency, and that's their clinical practices.
Well, I appreciate you going back and listening to that. I do think I have not had the opportunity to go back and listen to it, but I was thinking they were going to start doing free multiple choice questions. But I was thinking that it was going to be more of a phase-in approach. And so I wonder if.
Yeah, they never used those words, and I listened specifically for them.
Okay. I wonder if they were saying that they were going to start using the free multiple choice as of January 1st. And maybe it was a question of language where they were thinking that's when we're going to start including any of the free questions versus
Instead of all
of them be 3 questions. But I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I know that was not a conversation that any of us had with them. So that was just something they offered up to us. But yeah.
I'm happy to follow up with anything like that. I did make it a point to ask them that in a public meeting. I went to the microphone and said, you know, I have been receiving some questions on the 3 versus 4. And could you comment a little on the time frame or the timeline of moving to, are you still planning to go to all 3 test questions, you know, 3 options, or is it something where, you know, you comment more on that? And so that's when they made the comments to me at the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you sharing those concerns and going back and listening to it. I've received information from a lot of different places, and so sometimes it all kind of blends together sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
David, if you could, over time here, send maybe a summary of what you did here about how they're addressing the discrepancies in passing the test, what you just heard at the conference.
Mhm.
If you could give us a summary when you have time to do that, that would be great to send it out to the committee. Any other questions for David's report?
Yeah, and just to let you know too, so I was at that conference a few days last week, and then on Wednesday of this week, I'll be leaving to attend the mid-year conference for ASPPB for psychology. So may take me a little while to catch up on
Sure.
items, but I'll go ahead and get that to you as soon as I can.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So can you put the agenda back up for us?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question real quick? When you guys were talking about the provisional licensures for professional counselors and stuff, are you looking at the state statute 65 5819? I could share it with you. I have it up, but because I'm just trying to understand if this is what they're trying to change as well, because it kind of, to me, seems like if a person who isn't a licensed person, they have to use the word provisional. The word license may be used by such person only when prescribed by the word provisional. So I just wanted to understand if this was still in effect or if this is also encompassing what you guys are talking about.
It's a little bit different. So for temporary licenses, there is some language that says you can use the initials followed by a T to designate it as a temporary license, or that you can use the title, but make sure that it says it's a temporary licensed professional counselor.
So what?
For the provisional licenses, those are a little different because The temporaries would last for 2 years under the bill. The provisionals last for 1 year. And the provisionals, based on how they're described, they would be for individuals who are a little short of the educational qualifications for licensure, but they could get a provisional license while they're finishing those up. Like if you're missing a quick course or so, and then you could seek a permanent license. But the provisional language, that wasn't modified. That's something a little bit different than the temporary licenses. And so the provisional would still stay, but it does have that specific language that if you have a provisional license, you also can't use the permanent title without saying that you have a provisional license of that.
And is it still saying too that you have to be supervised and then your supervisor should sign off on anything that requires a QMHP, a qualified mental health professional, to sign off on?
For the new community-based licenses?
Yes.
Yeah, so the language, the best that I have seen, and they did modify that recently, but I believe the original language was that you would need to be within the scope of practice of CMHC and then under clinical supervision by someone at that facility. And then when they added those new groups, I believe it would still keep the clinical supervision requirement, but I would need to go back and kind of check those out. That language really wasn't forwarded to us for review. It was one of those that
Okay.
when that meeting happened, we were able to go back and kind of look and try to find the items of difference.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that as well, if we could have it.
Yeah, it's a whole new category of licensure, even though it's very similar to what exists in the statute already. It just creates this new category that allows people to represent themselves as fully, with the same credential as those that have met all the requirements. And again, this is their attempt at addressing workforce shortage. And I don't know who came up with that. That wasn't any part of what the BSRB proposed.
Another thing too, I wanted to say is like, we need nurses like a lot everywhere, RNs and LPNs, but we're not going to accredit an RN to be, to take the place of someone who's a student. I mean, because that just makes us, financially, even it's also hit to us financially when they start to do this, because we're not all going to get paid for our experience at a certain level, because then you're making that even watered down, and we're already watered down as a social worker, being reimbursed less than any other profession. So I'm just trying to say that, we have to look too at our gains. Are we really gaining anything by doing that, by adding more people who's going to muddy the water? I just want to say that on the record. So anyways.
Well, and just to let you all know, when the board had concerns about the new community-based license, we don't have very much involvement with any kind of payments that individuals receive. We're not involved in the reimbursement topic. That's really handled by larger agencies like KDHE and KDADS. But I didn't want someone to think that we were trying to deceive anybody by this new language on these license types. And I wanted to make sure we were proactive in letting those groups know about our license types that are included in the bill. The BSRB did bring forward too. So I did reach out to representatives from KDADS and also representatives from KDHE. And I set up a meeting with an individual from KDHE and just kind of walked through some of the different licenses that would be created in the bill to make sure that they can have their staff look through to see a little information about reimbursements, and then also just to clarify those intricate items of concern about those community-based licenses, just to make sure that they understood the language that was in the bill. Because ultimately, when it comes to things like reimbursements, like I said, we don't really have a role in that discussion, but I wanted to make sure if we could help facilitate any of those conversations that we were doing our part. But ultimately, it's probably going to be up to KDADS or KDHE. And when I found out about this was the reason that some of the entities wanted these new community-based licenses, I even offered in committee, perhaps we could have meetings. I'd be happy to facilitate as far as the BSRB could do, and making sure to connect those individuals with each other. But solving that issue by creating licenses for this purpose, it would have a lot of negative consequences. And so but offer to try to help out in alternative ways if we could be helpful in those ways.
Yeah, can you tell me who you spoke with?
Yeah, so I reached
for
out.
KDADs?
I
Yeah,
reached out to Andy Brown, with KDADS. He's the Commissioner of Behavioral Health. And also reached out to Sarah Ferdig, with KDHE. And so, just wanted to connect, them both, just start the conversation. To make sure that they were aware that and I did tell them too, I said, this bill has not passed. It is still available to be passed, but I wanted to start the conversation in advance because if the bill does pass, the implementation date for some of the things could be July 1st, and that's not a lot of time. So I wanted to
yeah.
let their staff start looking.
So I would say suggest the long-term support and service commissioner, Michelle Hayden, because she deals a lot with the HCBS programs who have to have qualified professionals in order to meet the Center for Medicaid Services regulations. And so that's who we have to look and report to versus just the behavioral health department because they're not involved with the home and community-based services. And so that would be a good person to add to that conversation because we really do look at the statutes in order to provide the waiver language that we comply with. So I think that's real important to add Michelle Hayden. It's Michelle, MICHELE period HEYDON at ks.gov. So because Andy's not involved with our waiver programs. He does something separate with the community mental health, and then we also do stuff with the mental health centers as well. And then also with like all the other providers, nursing and things like that. So we're involved with all those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that recommendation, Angela. Okay, we ready to move on? I think we are ready for old business, and we've talked the last couple of meetings about unprofessional conduct regulations. And one of the issues that we have been talking about is the 24-month rule. So all of the other mental health professions that are licensed to practice independently have the rule that it is considered unprofessional conduct to get sexually involved with a client a former client of less than 24 months, before 24 months. When we looked at our NASW Code of Ethics, well, first of all, I spoke with a number of practitioners, and I think I asked all of you the last time to do the same, to ask what their thought was about that rule. Everyone I spoke with thought, as I always have, that the answer is never, that it's never appropriate to get sexually involved with a former client, no matter how long it's been. And in fact, our NASW Code of Ethics says that social workers should not engage in sexual activities or sexual contact with former clients because of the potential for harm to the client. If social workers engage in conduct contrary to this prohibition or claim that an exception to this prohibition is warranted because of extraordinary circumstances, it is social workers, not their clients, who assume the full burden of demonstrating that the former client has not been exploited, coerced, or manipulated intentionally or unintentionally. So our Code of Ethics says that. As we were talking about it, we also looked at the Psychologist Code of Ethics, the APA, and they say also never, except under extraordinary circumstances. They leave an out, but they don't specify what those circumstances might be that would make that acceptable. So the question is, do we want to keep the 24-month standard as our unprofessional conduct standard? Do we want to add anything to it, such as some similar language to what what's in the code, the NASW Code of Ethics, that it would be incumbent on the social worker to be able to demonstrate that it was not harmful to the former client, or do we want to leave it as it is, which right now it's at 24 months? So what do you all think? What standard do you have, those of you that are practicing clinical, social work, what standard do you follow or have you thought was the ethical standard? Eric?
So I've always followed the never model, but I do like the idea of that it's the social worker's responsibility, because like I said, I do some stuff with the APA because I have a master's in psych too. So I do like the idea that you would put entirely the burden of the relationship on the practitioner and basically say, look, this is a horrible idea. If there's extenuating circumstances, then you're entirely responsible, not the client.
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying, because they, it's hard to say forever in our law where that, and I would say probably, I don't know the cases that have come before the BSRB, but I would suspect that the cases that have come were probably closer in time period than even the 24 months. So I don't know if that's a factor.
Andrea, you're on the CRC now, the Complaint Review Committee. So what has come before the committee? Have there been any of those kinds of complaints about getting involved with a former client?
I cannot remember how many, but I think there's just been one since I've been on, and I recently just started. So.
Oh, okay. And it was it less than 24-month situation? You don't remember?
I don't remember, to be quite honest. I know that in general, when the CRC reviews any kind of complaint, it's looking at all of the facts that come along from not just a one-sided, the investigators do a good job of presenting both sides. And so there is opportunity to kind of dig in a little bit more about what the specific circumstances were for whatever the complaint was.
So if we were to leave the 24-month standard, but add a phrase similar to what I quoted here about it being incumbent on the social worker to be able to demonstrate that, there was no harm was coming to the former client, would that change that, do you think? I mean, you said looking at all sides of it, if we say it's entirely on the social worker to demonstrate that it's not harmful, then does that eliminate the current focus on looking at all sides of it? Because that sounds like it kind of leaves a space for somehow it being decided that it's okay.
Well, I think, I just going back to what Mike had mentioned, that I think it's different too in rural areas, what that circumstance may or may not be versus a non-rural area. So I know that that's some language used in other professions just to give an opportunity to state the facts of what happened in that particular situation and at least have that reviewed. But I still don't know about the 24 months, just because our code of ethics does say forever, but at least having that caveat that the social worker could explain their particular circumstances, I would be open for.
And so adding that to the current standard that says 24 months, or would we want to say that generally it's never appropriate, but leave the 24 months as kind of the minimum, and then that the social worker would have to justify why that was acceptable? And I understand about availability of potential partners in a sparsely populated area, but I don't think that can trump the ethics of it and the potential of, harm to the former client.
No, this is Jane. I think we need to align with our NASW on it and the other professions, but most of the people.
That's different. The other professions are 24 months without any caveat in the current regulations. It's only the APA has it in their code of ethics, just like we do in ours, but the statute or the regulation for all the similar level licensure is 24 months. So it differs from our code of ethics.
I thought last time we met, we talked about a number. Did we table it?
Yeah, I think my memory is we asked everyone to kind of poll the people, other clinical social workers, and come back with an idea of what we wanted to do about this one.
I don't mind the extenuating circumstance, but I like the intent of it not being, putting never in. And I was raised in rural. Hutchison's considered rural. I was even smaller. And I don't think that's an excuse. Because of availability, I think we choose a profession that we have to uphold. So the ethics part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Jane, thank you for adding in that piece, because I am not from a rural area, so I don't have that lens.
I like the way that Cynthia, as you said, our code of ethics is never, but then you grant the minimum 24 months, and then it's all falls within the social worker's responsibility. I mean, I like the way you phrase that.
So we
and
could
I like
have
BSRB having that last say if there is a circumstance, because they get the investigative piece and they get all the other parts they need to make a good decision.
Well, and NASW does have a complaint process. So a client could file a complaint with NASW, and that's a whole separate, ethics complaint, separate from the regulatory function of the state.
I believe that's only for NASW members, though.
Well, you're correct. You're correct
Mhm.
about that. Yeah, and that's a shrinking number,
Yeah,
as I think it is.
Currently, that's where many get their insurance through the NASW. So that's kind of like the link that they have.
Although they're insurance now, you don't have to be a member anymore.
Right.
Yeah, national assurance or whatever it's called. Well, so then would it be a good idea to draft some language that would include this idea of potential harm at any time, but 24 months at least, and if there's a relationship with a former client at any time, it's incumbent on the social worker to be able to demonstrate that it's not causing harm to the former client. And we could work on that language and maybe we already are past the date, David, when we were going to finalize the unprofessional conduct regs, right?
Yeah, but I think with, the last advisory committee meeting was canceled because of legislative meetings that were just popping up all throughout the month of February. So you're not the only advisory committee that's still working on some of these regulations.
Okay.
I think
so. We'd be okay to finalize it at our next meeting, and I can make sure and get that language out to everybody before then, so
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Cynthia, what language were you proposing?
Well, what I was hearing was that something along the lines of that there's potential harm in having a sexual relationship with a former client at any time, but that the minimum would be 24 months to stay within unprofessional conduct guidelines. And beyond 24 months, it would be incumbent on the social worker to demonstrate that it was not, harming the former client in some way. I think the NASW language is that the former client has not been exploited, coerced, or manipulated intentionally or unintentionally. We could borrow that language if we think that's appropriate.
So what would happen if we stayed with everything you just mentioned, but just strike the 24-month
Well, that would be
option?
what the APA guidelines say.
Mm-hmm.
Never except in extenuating circumstances, and it's on the psychologist to show what those are.
I like that.
Eric, you'd rather it be
My
never. Go ahead.
concern on that is then someone could say at 1 month in or whatever, where at least the
Exactly.
24 months you're shoving it clear that there's a problem. Anyway, that's my
That was
Yeah.
gonna be sort of my point, is the 24 months does shove it into the future. Like you gotta wait at least 2 years, then it's still incumbent upon you even after 2 years. And
Mhm.
I think that pushes it where it's gonna make it really hard to keep any relationship alive without breaching that for 2 years.
Yes, exactly. It puts a bit of a roadblock in place, for someone to be sort of within the unprofessional conduct rules. Because you're right, Mike. Yeah, somebody could say, well, I can demonstrate it's not harming my client in 1 month after we stopped being therapist and client. I don't think anybody would think that was correct ever.
I like
Okay.
that wording too, coming from like a medical or from a different setting, an agency setting. When you have employees that are doing that questionable behavior, it's difficult sometimes to find things that support your disciplinary case in the BSRB regulation. So having something like that, a time frame, would be very helpful.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I'll work on that language and with David, and we'll get that out to you all before our next meeting so we can finalize that. Was there, I'm not remembering if there was a second one
There
that
was, there was one other item when it came to professional conduct regulations, and I'll go ahead and share my screen on that item. There was a past professional counsel and advisory committee that had considered some language dealt in the social media. And I think
Oh, right. Mhm.
the advisory committee had looked at this language and was wanting to think about it and then come back to it. So just a quick reminder, the 3 items that they had looked at as a possible new item in professional conduct regulations was number 1, practicing inappropriate boundaries with clients with regards to use of social media, including but not limited to using a personal profile to connect or communicate with clients in any social media platform, or accessing a client's social media pages without previous consent. Second possible option was disclosing confidential information through public social media. And then the third item, if engaged in distance counseling, failing to fulfill these requirements. A, informing the client of risks and benefits of distance counseling. B, disclosing the possibility of technology failure and providing alternative methods of service. C, detailing emergency procedures to follow when the counselor is unavailable. And D, taking appropriate steps to encrypt or ensure the security of confidential client information or any activity which protects confidential client information from risk or privacy breach. And some of the other advisory committees have discussed this. I did want to let you know, based on their comments, there were a couple of them that I think liked number 1, but this last bit that would have said it could be unprofessional conduct to access a client's social media pages without previous consent. They talked a little bit, I believe, about if they receive a report, that there may be some concern. Just accessing someone's page seems a little bit far-reaching in terms of being unprofessional conduct. As these are all public pages, but they said they agree in terms of the inappropriate boundaries with clients using social media, using a personal profile to connect or communicate with clients in the social media platform. They like those parts of it, but the last part there, as far as accessing a client's social media page without previous consent, that was the part that had some discussion and differing opinions on that. And then there was a pretty good amount of support for number 2 and number 3. So just kind of wanted to see if you all had any additional thoughts on these items.
Well, it does make sense that if you've got a client that may be suicidal and that's showing on their posting about it, that it could be useful for supporting that client, for the therapist to be able to see that. Again, if it's public on their page, they haven't, restricted it, who sees it, to only friends. I mean, the clients have access to our social media pages too that are public.
Well, and beyond that, the accessing sort of allows for an awful lot of interpretation. Like theoretically, my wife could be friends with somebody. She shows me their page and say, hey, look what so-and-so posts. I've technically accessed that, although unintentionally and not through my own efforts. I have, that's pretty, like, I would agree, it's pretty far reaching piece right there.
Yeah, that piece about friend of friends. Yeah, I've had that happen a number of times where I've seen something about somebody because they were a friend of mine, and it got commented on or whatever. So unintentional, yeah, accessing. So David, did the other professions that were considering this just strike that last, accessing a client's social media pages without previous consent?
Yeah, I think at least two of them did that. I think maybe some of the earlier ones adopted it before those conversations were being had on that piece. So I think when these get forwarded to the board, I think they'll probably maybe have some more thoughts about when they want to incorporate that change for their teams.
Well, I'd be in favor of striking that one phrase, that last part of the first section. What does anybody else think?
I agree with that.
I agree with that as well.
And what about the other two sections? The provisions there for distance counseling are part of the NASW. Those are included in the NASW telehealth guidelines. So those seem like basic requirements for providing telehealth in a confidential way.
Yeah, the question that I have is the profile to connect. The APA or the American Psychological Association, they put profiles out, and then people in the area read those profiles and they say, oh, that might be a counselor or therapist I'd like to try. So wait, you've used the internet, a personal profile to connect. To me,
So
I don't know what that means. Yeah.
I think it's intending to be the client's personal profile, but maybe that needs to be clarified, because you're right. Therapists put a profile out there for marketing purposes, and we want clients to be able to access that.
So the way I read this is that we're not accessing the client's personal profiles, not that they're not accessing ours. And then once they do access ours, it falls on the social worker to ensure that all of the distance therapy, telehealth,
Right.
et cetera, criteria are being met at that point.
Yeah, okay, I see that where it says the boundaries with clients. It's kind of
Yeah.
like what we're doing with the client, and
Not the other way, right?
And I can see, the people who write articles on blog posts and that I read that I think are very insightful, and I could see people reading those and then seeking out that therapist as possibly someone they could work with if it was within their geographical region or something like that. That's what I was wondering, because I know a lot of good things are posted out there that are helpful to people.
Do we think that first provision includes texting? That's not really is that considered a social media platform? I mean,
Not in my experience, but things like Facebook Messenger
right.
would count. But
Yes.
as far as a texting, it doesn't technically fall under social media as far as I'm concerned. Although
It's
I'm
not public. Yeah, it's direct person to person. It's not public, where others would see that you'd communicated with them.
But it's not
it would be
encrypted, and
Say it's also not encrypted.
Right.
That's true.
Or if you're in a
Yes.
group message. If you're in a group message.
Yeah, then that would probably violate that. Yeah, you would want to make sure that you were texting direct one-on-one. But I think a lot of clients, that's how, and therapists, that's how scheduling gets done now. It's mostly via text.
Well, you're saying to take out 10 where you have to to take out the appropriate step for encryption. Is that what you guys were saying?
No, I was just wondering in that first section if texting would be included as something we aren't supposed to use to communicate with clients. I don't see it that way, but it's not specifically, it just says on any social media platform, but texting is not really social media because unless if it's a group text, I guess you might call it that.
I know that we can text here with, we don't, some of us like it, some don't, but only an appointment time.
Right. No details, no discussion of their issues or anything, right? Just for scheduling and
Correct.
Does that need to be in there anywhere?
It would clarify it a little bit.
Because you have some people who do groups, right? When you guys are setting up times.
Well, the scheduler
group-
is usually the one that does it, not somebody from the clinical side or the, case management. But
let's say you're setting up a time for a group meeting.
With a client, no, it needs to be addressed directly to the client with the scheduled time only.
Yeah, but if you're doing like a DBT session with a group of clients, okay, there could be 6 people or 3 people involved. I think what you're saying is the scheduler is really just communicating with one at each of those encounters, not all 3, so that you're not
one at a time.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing about the texting or any of the social media platforms is it's all discoverable legally.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm just thinking of, I walked through way too many divorces with clients and, to being able to access texts that show that they had a scheduled mental health appointment. I wonder if that is a risk in terms of, how that could be used in a legal situation.
Would texting be a separate section and then just have this focus on social media?
That might be a good idea. I was just going to answer the other question too, was in the group part, we have to be careful of the PHI. So therefore, it needs to be individually sent, even if there is a group.
Right. But again, even the scheduling text, could be dangerous information in some circumstances in terms of revealing that someone had a mental health appointment.
Well, if it's discoverable, that's the one thing that we have to put in a letter, there's very limited that you can put in the letter to an attorney, or if it's going into a courtroom, that this person had 6 appointments or something like that. That's one of the few things you can put in there.
But that's only if there's a subpoena, right?
Well, we don't answer to anything else, but yes. With the seal, I should say.
I think you could also make the argument that us telling them our schedule, like somebody reaches out and says, I need an appointment this week, me saying I have availability at 9:30, 11:30, and 12:30 today isn't protected health information. Now, if you go beyond that, Like I use an electronic EHR and they go in and they schedule it, but I can tell them my availability and it's not protected health information.
No.
But what about their text back claiming one of those appointments?
That's still them giving information, not me.
Right, but I'm not thinking about that the therapist is culpable in any way in that situation, but just that the existence of that text accepting an appointment time, that's discoverable on that
Yeah.
person's phone.
Yeah, discoverable, but it doesn't mean the person showed up. So
Oh, that's true.
yeah.
That's
Now,
true.
the other element, I think what was being referenced in a group setting is the telephone numbers or whatever that were being sent. That would be protected health information, of a different person, like not the client. If there's 3 people in the group, all of their phone numbers, you can't send them all.
Right. That's why it'd have to be one-on-one. Well, I think maybe a separate section well, first of all, most informed consent, if you're using any means of electronic communication, it has to include that information could be breached, the security factors, et cetera, and what to do in case you get cut off, et cetera. So that risk of using text to communicate versus, I guess, just a phone call could take care of that concern if we had it in the informed consent. So do we think we should have a whole separate section about texting, since that seems to be something that's used pretty regularly?
I just noticed we're about 5 minutes away from the end of the meeting.
I know, yeah.
But since we're going to be working on the other language for the professional conduct, maybe we can kind of continue this conversation at the next meeting.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I guess be thinking about what would be in that text section if we're going to have a separate section to cover that. So I think that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I can send David, we have to take HIPAA course, training all the time annually. I can send him the specifics that say under the HIPAA, if that would help.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. I haven't seen that updated information in a while, so.
I'll do that.
Okay. I think we're about at the end of our time for today. Does anyone have any other thoughts, comments, questions?
Well, and Cynthia, there's a few items that are more like homework items for a future meeting. I thought maybe I just touched upon them briefly and then we could pick up on them at the next advisory committee meeting.
Okay, that'd be good. Thank you.
Okay, and some of these are located under new business, but one was a topic on changes to clinical training plans in KAR 102-2-8. And this was something the board talked about the last board meeting. There is language for most of the professions that you have to have an approved training plan, and then any changes have to be submitted to the board for review. And if you don't submit the change or have it approved within 45 days of making that change, you will lose the hours after that time period. And so there's been a little confusion by some people as far as what constitutes a change. So the board is looking for language to help identify what the actual changes are. And we have some input already from our staff members, but things like different location, new supervisor, different employer, those kind of things. But we want to identify some of those in regulation language that provide more understanding and visibility to that topic. And then also looking at the 45-day requirement penalty. That's in there to try to make sure that people don't waste time doing things that wouldn't be approved. So we want to make sure that they are reviewed and approved, but the consequence of losing all these hours afterwards is a pretty significant consequence. So if you have thoughts on things that might be an alternative to help with that, that's something that's going to be part of this discussion. And then the other two items under KAR 102-2-4A, continuing education, we want to make sure that we're being timely in reviewing our regulations. And that's a regulation that talks about how many continuing education hours social workers have to have, and then what categories qualify for acceptable social work continuing education hours. And so if you have thoughts on that, look through that regulation, look to see if you think there's any items that should be added, or any of those items revised. And then there's sort of an accompanying regulation, KAR 102-2-5, documentation for continuing education. And that regulation basically says what the BSRB would need as good evidence that you had completed those hours if you got audited. And so I believe it's been several years since the last time that regulation was adjusted. So be thinking about, with changes in technology and the internet, what is really good evidence of some of the completion of hours. And so look at those and be thinking of possible changes and be ready to discuss them. And I know we have pretty packed agendas sometimes, and we did miss that February meeting because of legislative meetings that conflicted. But I was thinking maybe for the next meeting, if it's okay with your schedule, maybe we could consider having a 3-hour meeting just to make sure that we're advancing through some of these items. I know we have a lot of different topics we talk about, and conversations are really helpful, but I thought that might be something to consider too.
This would be in June.
Yes.
So I'm fine with doing a longer meeting. How about everyone else?
I'm
That
okay
would
with
be-
that.
Say on the 22nd, I think would be June 22nd.
Double check.
I'm sorry, no, that's a Thursday, June 19th.
We would be available here. Our calendar for the office is open that day.
Does that work for everyone else? So should we do 9 to 12 or 10 to 1?
I'd have to be later. I have a supervisor meeting every Friday at 10. So
This is on a Monday,
Oh.
June 19th.
I thought yeah, okay, I'm in the wrong month.
I'd rather do 9 to noon than 10 to 1.
Yeah, I can do 9 to noon. Yes.
Does that work for you, David?
Yes, that would be good with us.
All right, let's plan 9 to 12 on Monday, June 19th. And meanwhile, before then, we'll get language out about the 24-month issue. And David was going to send the reference for looking at that legislation that's CCR 131. So you can see what all's included in that. And as I said, encourage you to contact your senator and let them know your concerns about what's in that bill or in that bundle. The other two bills actually looked pretty good, as I recall, that they bundled it with, but they were much less complex than our 2340. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? Thank you all for attending, and we will see you on June 19th.
Do we need
Anybody
to
have-
motion to end? I
Oh,
motion.
I'm sorry. Thank you,
So
Andrea.
move.
And okay, move in second.
Support, Mike, support.
Thank you very much. All in favor?
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Hearing none, we are adjourned. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
See you all
everyone.
later. Bye-bye.